As the Christmas season is in full swing, so are the listener stories that we've been receiving. So let's continue to keep Christmas creepy with these accounts of the unexplained.
The first time it happened, I was sleeping and woke up because I felt a hand on my leg and I realized that I couldn't move.
And he come across this object on the ground, which was the shape of a flying saucer. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground.
When I raised my head back up, I was turning my head, and out of my peripheral vision, I seen something hop to a tree. And it was tall, about 7, 8 foot tall, and it was black, real hairy, like a gorilla.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Nick Ryan, and this is episode 37. Our first story of the evening comes from Jacqueline, and she calls her experience Ghost. Jacqueline says, I've been listening to your podcast for the past few weeks and can relate to a lot of the stories brought up by other listeners. I never realized how many experiences I've had. However, after really thinking about it, there has been a lot, including seeing my mother that night that she had passed, but that is a story for another time. Anyway, I had a really strange thing happen to my husband, who is a complete skeptic, and I, while driving home the other night. To preface this, we live in the Bridgewater Triangle, which I do not know if this has anything to do with what happened or not. The road we were driving on has no streetlights, and is in a pretty quiet neighborhood. All of a sudden, a white mist about 3 feet tall was in front of my car, on the right side near where the headlight would be. We drove through it because it only appeared a second before we got there. I looked at my husband, and we both acknowledged that it was really strange. However, we haven't spoken about it since. It has been in my mind since it happened, though. I know this experience isn't wild, but it has just been in the back of my head ever since, wondering if anyone else has ever experienced anything like this. Our next story comes from Kendall in Oregon. Kendall says, Hello, my name is Kendall. I live in a small town in Oregon. I love your podcast because it hits home to me. I have many paranormal encounters. My sister feels that I am the doorway between the living and the dead. I try to ignore it. In fall of 2011, it was early morning, and my boyfriend was out hunting with his father. I was lying in bed with my 2 dogs, and I heard the TV from the other living room click on. I could hear what sounded like our Xbox playing, and it sounded like a shooting game. I was still tired, so I decided to text my boyfriend from the other room. I said, Did you not go with your father? About 5 minutes later, I got a reply that said, Yes, just got on the landing. My heart sunk, and I realized someone was in our house. Then, all of a sudden, the TV clicked off, and the house was silent. I got up and looked around the house, and it was completely empty. In 2013, in the winter, I had dated a guy, and his brother got into an accident and passed away at the mill he worked at. A few weeks after his death, I had a dream that he came and brought me to his home, and his wife and kids were there. His daughter was playing in her room, and his wife was in the kitchen. I asked him why he was there, and he told me to tell her, I am still here, and I am always around Maddie, their young daughter. That morning when I woke up, I wrote to his wife about my crazy dream. She replied and said, It's crazy you say that. Maddie keeps telling me that she sees her daddy. In 2014, I was home alone, and I was in our laundry room that was also in our kitchen. As I was folding the laundry, I looked into the kitchen and watched my dining room light start unscrewing itself, like someone was taking it off. It fell down onto my table. It did not break, but only dented the table. For how high up it was, it should have slammed and the glass should have shattered. In 2019, it was a terrible winter here. It snowed us in. My sister had to come and rescue me and my son so we could stay at her house that still had power. That night, as we were in bed, I woke up to what felt like a person holding onto the bed and leaning on it. All of a sudden, I felt someone holding the blankets over me. I couldn't move and felt a very heavy thickness in the air. I finally got the blankets off of me and ran into my sister's room. I can also feel when bad and good spirits are present around me. I feel the thickness in the air and the change in color to our world. It turns gray and cloudy. I have more stories to tell if you'd like to know. Thank you. Our next story comes from Karen in Pennsylvania. She says, "This is going to sound crazy. I'm sure you've heard this before. I was at Walmart a few years ago. Yes, Walmart. I was walking into the dairy aisle when I saw a strange little girl. She was standing alone beside a shopping cart. No one was with her. What was strange about her was, as I was coming up behind her, was her long hair. It was almost translucent, with no color. It was clear. I have blonde hair, so I noticed this as unusual for a young child to have. I thought she might be albino. Just when I was thinking in my head that this was an unusual child, she turned her head around and looked directly at me, right in the eyes. I was shocked. It was as if she knew my thoughts and was turning around to acknowledge me. I could feel her reading my mind. Then I noticed her skin. It was almost clear, and you could see blue veins beneath the skin. It looked like wax paper. She had large, electric blue eyes. I was shocked as I walked by her, not only because of her looks, which were unusual, but very beautiful, but also by the creepy feeling that she could read my mind. I walked past her, and she looked so out of place and lonely. There was nothing in the cart, no mother's purse, and no items. I went down another aisle, collected my thoughts, and then I went back to find her, as I thought it was odd for a young girl to be alone without any adult, and to see if her mother had come back. In a matter of a minute, she was gone. I looked down every nearby aisle, but no trace of her. No trace of the empty shopping cart either. She was gone. Absolutely no trace of her anywhere, and I looked because I now was curious. I cannot guess what I had just seen. I thought maybe an angel, but did not get a loving or calm vibe from her. It was definitely not a small child or albino. It looked like a small child, but the creepy feeling I got was not of a small child, and truly believed her to be reading my mind. Her eyes were bright blue, and the skin was like clear wax. The most unusual child I have ever seen, then and now. Just wanted to share this. Thank you for reading. Karen. Our next story comes from Celeste in Australia. Celeste says, "Hi there, I've been listening to your podcast for some time, and I thought of sharing my story, since it would be great to hear your thoughts and see if anyone else has experienced this too. I grew up in Australia in the suburbs, not too far from the city. However, I was close to a small airport. Constantly hearing helicopters and planes fly over at random times during the day or night. The airport offers flying lessons, and often very late at night or early in the morning, so it wasn't unusual to see things blinking in the sky. I have always been a believer in life outside of our planet, and have always been fascinated by UFOs. At the time I was in high school, and was in the living room that overlooked our front balcony. It was around 5 to 6 p.m., still daylight, and I noticed a black helicopter flying over my street, which looped around. After 5 minutes, it stopped above my neighbor's house, located in front, diagonally from ours. It had its searchlight on, and it turned and faced my house, almost as if it knew I was watching them. It hovered for what seemed like minutes, until it eventually headed back to the airport, which was a few minutes away. I had never seen a black helicopter before, so I began researching them, thinking they'd be army or police, but it didn't seem so common in Australia. I eventually stumbled on black helicopter stories from the U.S. that are usually associated with Secret Service or Defense Forces, mainly after a UFO sighting or incident has occurred. I since then have never seen that helicopter or any other similar to it. I still don't know what they were doing hovering in my street with the searchlight on. Thanks for reading. Sorry for the length. Our next story is from Tiffany in Arizona, and she calls her experience UFO. She says, "I recently discovered your podcast and have been binge listening for several days. Thanks for the wonderfully creepy and intriguing stories. I've had several paranormal experiences throughout my life, from sleep paralysis to seeing ghosts, and other experiences that I think I avoided by listening to that gut feeling everyone gets but doesn't always listen to. But this encounter is about a UFO I saw. About 10 years ago, while living in a small town in Florida, my husband at the time and I were riding our ATVs in the pasture. Yep, it was a small town. I stopped to take a break and was looking up into the beautiful blue sky, when out of nowhere, a silver sphere appeared. This sphere seemed to be extremely high up. There was a small airport in town, but it usually had only single-engine planes, and no one would mistake this object for an airplane. This object came into my vision and just stopped. It just stayed in midair for several moments. I don't think it was more than maybe 60 seconds. I sat on my ATV just staring at it. I blinked a few times trying to process what I was seeing. Then, from a complete standstill, the silver sphere bolted off, out of sight. I sat there looking for it for a few moments, but it was gone. I know this was certainly no airplane or average military craft. Whatever it was, I don't think I will ever forget seeing it. Our next story comes from Caitlin in Michigan, and she calls her experience God's Hand. Caitlin says, "Hello, Nick. I'd first like to say I love your podcast, and I'm an avid listener. I have many different kinds of stories, but this one stands out the most. A bit of background first. I grew up in a house of believers, and my mother is a psychic and channels for people. This is my bathroom layout. As you walk in, there is a sink across from you. Then if you look right, there is a big closet, and to the left there is the tub and toilet, and right near the door to the left is the heating vent. I used to live downstate Michigan in a small town. When I was around 5 or 6, I loved to sit on the heating vents to get warm. This one night was different, though. Instead of running to the one in my bedroom, I went into the bathroom. I was sitting on the vent facing toward the closet. I started to see a bright, almost blinding gold outline of a hand that got more and more solid. I blinked and looked away, but when I looked back, it was still there. I stood up and slowly walked toward the closet. It seemed to almost be reaching out to me. Then, all of a sudden, I ran into my mother's room and told her what had happened. She just sleepily replied, "It's God's hand, sweetheart. Go back to bed." Thanks for taking the time to read my story. I have so many more ghost, mediation, lucid dream, channeling, and etc. stories if you want to hear more. Our next story comes from Dean. Dean says, "I have seen and experienced a lot of unexplainable things in my life, and I have come to believe that what we socially accept as scientifically true and provable is very limited, and there is so much more out there that either has not yet or cannot be proven. I have learned not to be so ready to dismiss things I hear as crazy or impossible, so thank you for your podcast. I love your efforts to present the facts and not exaggerate them or present your own belief as to the cause or source of these phenomena. That said, though my unexplainable experiences vary, I will share a few with you that are in an area that I noticed you have not talked specifically about: prophetic dreams. My first story I call My Father's Dreams. We moved often when I was growing up. It was always a bit of a challenge to find a new place to live, especially for a family with lots of kids and very little money. I noticed that my father was always able to make a decision and be at peace with his choice almost immediately upon seeing the house. I asked him about it once, and he confided that he was able to have such instant peace due to his choice not being his own. When I insisted on an explanation, he told me that before each move, before he had even begun to look at housing options, he would have a dream where he saw the house he would live in detail, complete with our furniture inside of it, almost as if he was being given a glimpse into the future. I scoffed at the ridiculousness of how such a thing sounded, insisting that he must have had the dream afterward, and remembered it as if it had been an old dream. My father said nothing more than, "You will see." A half year later, my parents made a decision to move in exchange for work bonuses. I had long forgotten about my old conversation with my dad, when one morning he came to me and told me about the dream he had had the night before. In his dream, he had passed through the rooms and halls of the house complete with our furniture. He described the house to me in detail, telling me where everything was, including such things as what he had seen looking out the window. He asked me to keep it a secret and to not tell my mother, but that he wanted me to know the truth. Not too long after, my parents went to house hunt in the new town we would be moving to several hours away. Upon returning, my mother was agitated, insisting he was making his decision too hastily, but my father insisted that he had found the one and he wouldn't look at a single other house. With all the business of moving, I completely forgot about my father's dream till one morning, long after we had settled into the new house. I was walking down the hallway and realized that what I saw out the window at the end of the hall was exactly the view my father had described in his dream. As I stood there stunned, I realized that every detail of the house was just as my father had described so many months ago, down to every little detail, including the furniture that wasn't ours, but had been left for our use by the owner. Though I found my father to not possess any prophetic ability in any other way, I continued to ask my father about his dreams before each move, and each and every one came true. Dean's second story he calls Dreams of Natives. He says, I spent time in Venezuela in 2003, in high school attending a remote missionary school along the Orinoco River, and heard and saw things while on outings with the natives I cannot explain. While in Venezuela, there was a missionary family, co-workers of my parents, that worked in a very remote jungle location. They had been planning to move out of their home in the jungle, as the work they had been doing was completed, and the natives had been fully trained to continue the work without them. With their move in mind, the missionaries had traveled by plane, which was the only way to access the tribe quickly, into town to begin looking into the logistics of their upcoming move. When they arrived back into the tribal village, all seemed well as they went to bed that night. The next morning they awoke to find the entire village on their doorstep, whispering amongst themselves, waiting for the missionaries to wake. The missionaries came out confused and cautious and asked the elders of the village what was going on. They were told that the previous night every member of the village had had the exact same dream, where God had told them that the missionaries had to go now. The missionaries were quite confused and explained to the natives, who they had lived amongst for many years and had come to think of as family, that all would be well, that this was just a dream, and reminded the natives of their plans to move out of the tribe in the next few months. The more they tried to calm and reassure the natives, the more insistent the whole tribe became that they must do all they could to leave the tribe immediately, refusing to disperse or be distracted from their passionate insistence, until the missionaries assured them that they would radio for the plane to return for them as soon as the pilot could fit them into their schedule. They were informed that they could not be fit in for a flight out until the next day. Later that evening they got a call back on the radio that the pilot was running a bit ahead of schedule, and he could in fact come to get them, mother, father, and kids, just before sunset, under the condition that they were to bring nothing, as the pilot would barely be able to carry their combined weight on top of the load he was already hauling. So at the insistence of the natives, they agreed, and with not an extra change of clothes or a single possession to their name, they pulled off the makeshift jungle runway just as the sun was beginning to set, still wondering what all this drama had been about, and thinking that they were wasting money on an expensive flight over nothing. The next morning, the missionaries tried to contact the natives over radio at the assigned time. As long as they had lived in the village, a radio call had been made twice a day, at an assigned time from the missionaries' radio, into the missionary headquarters to touch base, as this was the only means of communication into such a remote tribe. Even when the missionaries left for a time, the natives would take up the post of checking in with the missionary headquarters to communicate any of their medical or other needs and just to touch base with civilization. On that day after leaving the tribe, no one could be reached by radio. In fact, they would hear from no one from the village for almost a week. When they were finally contacted by a member of the village they had left, they were told not to bother coming back, that none of their possessions were there. Confused, the missionary asked for the whole story and was told this. After the missionaries had pulled up off the runway, the natives had a great sense of peace settle over them, and they returned to their huts to settle in for the night. Not long after the last of the light had left the evening sky, there was a great noise of yelling and smashing that rose up around the empty home of the missionaries. Men in camouflage and face paint stormed into the huts of the villagers, dragging them out into the center of the village. The men shone bright lights in their faces, pointed guns at them, and demanded to know where the missionaries were, where the natives hiding them. When informed that the missionaries were not there and had just left, the men became hysterical and began to beat some of the natives, insisting they were lying. Their scout had told them just the day before that the missionaries had arrived by plane, and that there was no way that they could have left again so soon. After searching the whole village, The men systematically smashed and then burned everything belonging to the missionaries that they didn't carry off. The native then told the missionaries how he, upon realizing that the radio had been destroyed, had hiked for days, as fast as his legs would carry him, through the dense jungle to reach the nearest village that had a working radio to contact them. Through a series of questions, the missionaries came to understand what had happened. The men who had come to kidnap them were guerrilla mercenaries from Colombia, who had crossed the border, traveling primarily by river, and had come to take missionaries for ransom back to Colombia, as they had run out of Americans to take hostage back to their own country. Upon hearing about missionaries residing in a jungle village, they had set up a lookout to watch for the return of the missionaries. As relieved as we all were that my parents, co-workers, and their children narrowly escaped what surely would have been a death sentence, it has always stayed and haunted me knowing that in North America this scenario would have ended very differently, and wondering if it is not all due to our obsession with tangible proof and logic, but if the natives possessed an ability to be more spiritually connected to all have seen the same prophetic dream. Dean. Our next story comes from Jeannie. Jeannie says, "Hello, my name is Jeannie, and I have seen what I think was a guardian angel. My husband's angel, to be exact. My husband and I were sleeping one night around 10 years ago or so, and yet it is still so clear to me. He was sleeping on his back, and I was sleeping on my stomach, with my head turned toward him. You know that feeling you get when you feel someone near you as you're sleeping? Well, that is what I felt. I opened my eyes and saw her. It was a her. She was a bright white flowing image with no real form to her, floating above him, looking him over really good. I shook him awake and said, 'Your guardian angel is above you.' He opened his eyes and said, 'I don't see anything.' He then went back to sleep. She looked over at me, and a huge feeling of calm and peacefulness came over me, and I went back to sleep. This experience was incredible. I don't tell too many people about this because they wouldn't believe me. So thank you for listening and believing. Sincerely, Jeannie." Our next story comes from Paige in Maryland. She says, "Hi, my name is Paige. I live in Maryland right now, but these stories are from many different states I've lived in. I don't usually write to anyone like this, but after the 2 coincidences, I had to. But I promise you, these are as true as what my own eyes saw. The first is about a UFO a few friends and I witnessed. We were outside, and it was a warm night in Georgia. We just so happened to be looking at the stars. I specifically saw what I thought was a shooting star, up until it made some unnatural movements of one. It almost looked like it was headed downward, but then it made almost like a Circle 8 movement. It moved around like that for a few seconds, and then all of a sudden flew off too quick for me to really process it. After it was gone, I looked at my friends and said, 'Hey guys, I don't want to scare you, but I think I just saw something weird in the sky.' I saw they were also looking at the sky, and they all immediately said that they weren't the only ones who had seen it. Your story and experience from that night you saw it in your bedroom reminded me so much of it, because the way you described it sounded awfully similar, and it even made me tell my coworkers in excitement. I listened to your podcast while I work. The next experience is also very similar in different ways. The next one is about the sleep paralysis experience in Michigan. I've never had night terrors or sleep paralysis before in my life. This happened about a year ago, when I was 20. I moved with my boyfriend up in Michigan around this time. He would go to work early in the morning, and I would stay home and sleep until my work shift. There was a joke going around Facebook about sleep paralysis demons. I never shared any of these posts, but I made one myself as a joke between my friends and I online. This is why it creeped me out. That exact next morning, when I went to sleep, it happened for the first time. I woke up lying on my stomach, my left cheek lying on my pillow. I knew what sleep paralysis was, but had never felt it before. And when I opened my eyes, I immediately felt a strong presence of someone else being in the room. I almost panicked, but calmed down once I realized what was happening. I steadied my breath and closed my eyes to avoid seeing anything that might terrify me. I felt whatever presence I was sensing get closer, and I felt almost like a pressure on my back where my lungs start, and then I felt the pressure literally pushed out of my breath. Honestly, I don't know how to describe it, except it felt as though it was trying to push out my soul. Right after that, I was able to move, so I sat up and couldn't get back to sleep in fear that it might happen again. The feeling of a presence completely stopped. It was so scary, regardless of if I knew what to do. I told my boyfriend about it and I started sleeping when he was asleep because I never wanted to be alone if it happened again. Even though I didn't see anything, the feeling alone gives me chills to think about, even now. These are my only 2 stories I think I've ever had in my whole life that were anywhere near unexplainable or scary. Thank you for reading this. I hope knowing that someone else had similar experiences makes you feel a sort of comfort. Keep doing what you're doing, because it really is what I enjoy listening to almost every day. Paige. Our next story comes from Melissa from South Dakota. Melissa says, "Hi Nick, I'm new to your podcast and I enjoy listening to it, especially while I'm at work. It makes the time fly while being entertained. I listened to your Missing Time episode, and I have a story very similar to it. Now this is not my personal experience, but an old friend of mine, and I thought I'd share with you and your listeners. This takes place on the Crow Creek Reservation in South Dakota, and the house this happened at is located a few miles from the reserve, so it's kind of in a desolate area where it does get pretty dark and creepy. My friend had went outside with family. They were visiting and chatting away as the evening went on, and they kept hearing noises, not knowing what or where it was coming from, and they were outside, mind you. Now deer are very common down there, and you do get a few mountain lions here and there, but they could not see what was making all the ruckus. So him and the other 2 guys finally decided to investigate. Fearing that it could be possibly a mountain lion, they insisted that the women head inside with the kids. Now it started to get dark, and so they took a flashlight, as well as a shotgun for safety precautions, and as they went around back, they saw a little green man running about. Without even thinking about it, or what they were seeing, they started to chase it. It drew them further out. They kept losing sight of it because the grass and weeds were pretty tall, and he said it didn't feel like they were gone for more than 15 to 20 minutes. After a few minutes of searching for it, they decided that they had scared it off, and that they should head back before the women got too worried. As they entered the home, they found the women upset and panicked, and they didn't understand why. Finally, his sister-in-law asked them where they had been, and she said that they had been gone for 3 hours. Shaken by what she had said, they didn't believe her. They all swore that they had just been gone for 15 to 20 minutes. So not believing her, they looked at the clock, and sure enough, 3 hours had passed. She said that after 15 minutes had passed, she got worried and went outside and called for them, and got no reply. After an hour passed, she called everyone she knew, and no one had seen them. To this day, he still doesn't know what happened or where the time went. I once watched this documentary about alien abductions and people missing time, and not knowing where it had gone, so I'm thinking this could possibly be the case for them. They couldn't remember because maybe they were forced to forget what really happened to them. Who's to say, you know? There have been multiple UFO sightings down there as well, so maybe they really were abducted. In Melissa's second story, she has this to say. I was so excited when you posted an updated episode. I love listening, especially when I'm at work. I have a story or 2 to relate to the Bigfoot screams in your newest podcast. I was honestly so excited when I heard what the storyline was going to be around. I have personally never heard or seen a Bigfoot, but I know plenty of people that have, and the stories gave me goosebumps. These all happened on Native American reservations in South Dakota. This first story happened when I was a toddler. At the time, my family and I were living on the Crow Creek Reservation in South Dakota, also called Fort Thompson, and my dad loved fishing. One evening, him and his buddies went down to the dam and caught some fish. They brought them back to our house to fillet, and it was getting dark out, and next to our house is a small wooded area that people call the Sand Pit. The first howling that you played in your podcast with the dogs barking is exactly what my dad, mom, and his buddy heard. And when that thing started howling, it was so loud and so close to our house, all the dogs in the neighborhood went crazy. My mom looked out the front door, and she said that all the dogs had taken off down the road toward the sand pit. My dad was also a hunter, so he went inside and grabbed his shotgun, and him and his buddy jumped in his truck and went down towards the sand pit. He told my mom when he got around the corner that all the dogs stood at the edge of the woods and kept barking while this thing was still howling. Cops were called, but were too frightened to enter because they didn't know what they would have found. It eventually stopped, but no one went in there for a few months. The second story happened a few years down the road. My mom and dad had split, and my dad eventually remarried and moved down a little further to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. He lived a ways out where houses were spread apart. He said one night he was in one of the rooms cleaning his guns. Like I said, he was a hunter. And his wife was making them dinner, and his 2 stepchildren were in the living room playing, when his wife heard someone honking outside. As she opened the door, she heard them screaming for her to stay inside and not to come out. They hollered at her, "Something's on top of your house." She quickly stepped back in and shut and locked the front door, and yelled for my dad and told him something was on top of their house. He went back into the room, grabbed his gun, and told them to get down in the basement. He went out and looked around the house and looked onto the roof and didn't see anything. He looked over to the house next to him and saw people looking out their window toward our house. He ran over and asked if they had seen anything, and they told him about a half hour ago when it was still a little daylight outside. They saw this huge thing they said was about 7 to 8 feet tall, black, crawling on the side of their house, and then it just sat down on the roof. They didn't know his number to warn him, so they called friends of theirs to have them go over there and check. They said as soon as they pulled up to the house, this thing got scared, crawled back down the side, and in just 6 steps, this thing had made it over a hill they had in the back of their place. My dad said he tried to make that run, and he said this thing must have been huge, because he said it took him 5 minutes to reach this hill, that this thing had made it over with such ease. There have been numerous sightings as well as hearing screams and hollering all over the Indian Reservation. Now the Crow Creek Reservation is split up between 3 sections. There's Fort Thompson, Bad Nation, and Crow Creek. Now Crow Creek is about 10 to 15 minutes from Fort Thompson, give or take. There's this couple that had a ranch out there, and it was in a valley all by its lonesome, and the man liked sitting outside, how old men do. He said it was nearing night, but there was a full moon out, and where he lived shone some pretty good moonlight. He said he was just sitting outside, and all of a sudden, he saw 2 giant black figures walking toward his house. He said he never saw anything so big before, especially 2 of them. Now this is a guy who wasn't the type to be scared, and he was fearless because he ended up bringing out his shotgun and had started shooting at them. He hit one of them in the arm, and he said it let out the loudest, most god-awful scream he has ever heard in his life. He said they started to run away, and like the fearless man he was, he got in his truck and followed them to the back of these hills near his house. He said he saw them disappear, and when he drove his truck to where they had gone, he came across a cave inside this hill that was big enough to fit his truck through. He was surprised and said he didn't try to go into the cave, but instead went to these other hills and found even more huge caves inside those hills. I wonder what really is back there and hiding. I'm sorry this story is so long, but I just thought I'd share, following your newest podcasts. Thanks for your time, Melissa. I'd like to remind all of our listeners that if you've experienced something that you can't explain and you feel as though no one will listen, you can confide in us. Sometimes just anonymously sharing your story can be very liberating. And remember, not all of our stories that I receive get shared on the show. So if you have an encounter that you'd like to tell us about, but not have it read on air, we're happy to help in that respect too. The important thing to remember is that you're in good company, and we're all here for the same reason: to ask questions that everyone else is too afraid to ask. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Jacqueline, Kendall, Karen, Celeste, Tiffany, Caitlin, Dean, Jeannie, Paige, and Melissa for writing in and sharing their story with all of us. If you have a story or question for the show, you can email me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit paranormal-mysteries.com. You can also get involved by joining our forum and by following us on social media. If you're wondering how you can support the show, you're doing it right now, just by listening. You can also help by subscribing to the show and sharing it with your friends. If you're looking for additional ways to support the show, you can visit patreon.com/paranormal mysteries and become a patron. New episodes are available on all of your favorite podcast apps, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. From all of us at Paranormal Mysteries, thank you very much for listening, and please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.